Hello fiber friends and welcome. We are going to get out the drum carder today. I have some alpaca and I'm going to go stash diving for some wool, and we are going to blend up a couple of alpaca wool batts in different proportions of fibers, and then we are going to spin them and swatch them to see what kind of fabric we get when we have 100% alpaca and various blends of wool. So that is our adventure for today. I can't wait to get started. I have spun quite a lot of alpaca in my spinning career, and I have worked with some alpaca in my projects as well. This is one of my favorite shawls that I've ever made. I wove it on my triangle loom from hand spun alpaca yarn, and a lot of it was carded into batts. There's some other fibers in here too, but there is a lot of alpaca. Something I've heard a lot in the community is that you should not spin and knit a 100% alpaca sweater because the alpaca can stretch out over time. I've heard of people saying that they knit a 100% alpaca sweater and they knit a size medium, but after wearing it a couple of times, it had stretched and grown to a size extra large, which was not what they wanted, and they were very disappointed with that. I've also heard some people say that they have used alpaca for all kinds of things, not blended it with anything, and had a wonderful garment that they wore forever and ever, and it never grew or stretched. Now, I'm not entirely sure why this happens. I've heard so many theories about it. I know that there are so many different components of things that affect our final yarn and our final knitted projects, you know, from the preparation to the finishing techniques to everything in between. There could be a lot of things at play here. But something you will hear people say is that if you are going to do a garment with alpaca and you're going to spin it and knit it, that you should blend it with some wool. And so that's what we're going to do today. We are going to get out the drum carder today. I have some alpaca and I'm going to go stash diving for some wool, and we are going to blend up a couple of alpaca wool batts in different proportions of fibers, and then we are going to spin them and swatch them to see what kind of fabric we get when we have 100% alpaca and various blends of wool. So now I think it's time to put the shawl away, put on the apron, get out the drum carder, and let's get busy. Here are the stars of the show. This is the alpaca that I will be using for this project to experiment with, and this is the wool that I will be blending. I'm not going to use all of the wool, but I have enough here to pull from. And this is merino that I scoured. The sheep's name was King. Unfortunately, I am not sure what the alpaca's name was.
Oh, that's fine. You'll spin my fiber, but you can't even remember my name. I just think it's a little rude. That's all. But go ahead, enjoy yourself. Spin away.
There are a couple of helpful things to consider when you are choosing a wool to blend with your alpaca. One of those things is that it can make spinning a little easier if you have the two fibers in a similar staple length. It makes drafting easier, and you won't tend to have so much of the shorter staples bunching up in your hand while the longer staples get drafted out. It's not a requirement, but it is helpful for a consistent draft. Another important thing to keep in mind is to choose a crimpy wool if you want to add that bouncy wool characteristic to the alpaca. Having a drapey alpaca fiber combined with a drapey wool fiber is just gonna result in a drapey yarn, and the idea here, which of course if you want that, that's fine, but the idea here is to add some bounce and memory or elasticity to the alpaca. And so we are doing that by adding wool. We want to add a wool that has some crimp to it and that bouncy characteristic that we're looking for. Another thing to keep in mind, if you want to ensure that you maintain the soft characteristic of the alpaca, particularly if you have a very fine alpaca, a very low micron count. Look for the same or similar feel to the wool that you are blending. If you have a very coarse wool, you might get a little bit of a scratch or itch factor added into the alpaca. And another thing to keep in mind is that alpaca comes in a range of beautiful natural colors, and you can have so much fun playing with those natural colors. Wool doesn't have to be white. Wool has also a variety of natural shades of browns and grays that you can get it in. So consider the blend and how you might want to take advantage of those natural colors and play with that a little bit. Keep color in mind. There's a lot of fun and exploration to be had there. After measuring everything out, I had a little bit of alpaca left, and I thought it would be fun to throw in a bonus 50-50 wool and alpaca. Of course, we can't go further than this because then we're blending alpaca to wool, and this video is about blending wool with alpaca. So 50-50 would, I guess, be the end of our range if we're basing the other end on 100% alpaca. So we will do this one as well. It's not going to be quite as big of a bat as the others, but this is what I had left. So the next thing to do is get carding. The drum carder I'll be using is my deluxe manual drum carder. It's a Brother drum carder. I have a link for this in the description below if you're interested. The carding cloth I have on here, it's a 90 TPI, and I find that to be great for working with alpaca to make a nice smooth bat. I have to start somewhere, so I think I'll start with the 100% alpaca. I'm not going to really measure it out. I'm just gonna take the bat and halvesies, just like that, and I'll spin each and ply them together. I'm not going to do a center pull ball. I know that would save me from wasting any at the end, but if you want to know why I am making an informed decision about this little blend study, I guess, you can check out my video about applying from a center pull ball. It's not bad or wrong, it's just that it does affect the finished yarn, and I'm choosing to do a standard 2-ply, 2 separate bobbins to get a good look at whatever this yarn turns out in the end. So I am going to spin in a Z direction, that's a clockwise direction, for all of my singles, and then when I ply each of the singles together, I will be spinning in an S or a counterclockwise direction. So let me get going here. As far as the diameter of this spin, I would love to do a 2-ply, like a lace weight for all of this, but that would take all week. and I don't have time. But also I'm going to do this a little thicker because I think it will be easier to see what kind of bounce and all of that we get in the end, and I want you to be able to see it on camera. And so I'm going to do this a little chunkier. I'm going to go for a worsted. We'll see how that kind of plays out as we get spinning. So I have, if you look at the setting for the speed control, I have it set to about 12 o'clock, which is straight up and down. All right, so I am just going to do a lovely long draw with this fiber. There is still some VM in there, but wasn't too concerned about it. I can always pick that out while I spin. So there it is. This is a really soft alpaca. It's like butter. It's softer than kittens. So here we are at the beginning of the plying process, and I'm loving how this yarn looks. I think it's just the right diameter I was going for, a little bit more worsted. This might even poof up to be a little more bulky after I wash, and I might thwack it a little bit, not too rough, but this was a long draw, so that'll give it kind of a nice bloom and loftiness. Halfway through the 10% wool, 90% alpaca. This is what the bobbin is looking like. So far, I don't feel that much of a difference with the spinning. It still feels more dense and drapey than it does lofty and bouncy. So it definitely has that feel of the alpaca in it. Although I will say that this one seemed a little bit easier to draft. And I'm not sure if that's entirely because of the wool component in there, or perhaps this batt was carded an extra time or two because I was blending the wool, where the 100% alpaca batt, I didn't put as many times through the carder. I think I did that one 2, and I think I did this one 3 if I recall. But that could have caused the difference with the drafting, or perhaps the wool blend in there is affecting the drafting. So that was just something I thought was interesting to note about this 10% wool and 90% alpaca blend. I do have to say though, there is one difference. When I unroll this batt and I kind of bounce it, the 100% alpaca, when I unrolled it, it just slid right apart. It didn't want to stay in a batt form, and this one is actually holding its shape in a batt form, and it's a lot more bouncy. So that is something interesting to note, that even that 10% addition of wool is giving it a little bit more, I guess, structure within the unspun batt. So that's fascinating. I'm very interested that that's happening. I am spinning this at the same exact settings that I spun the 100% alpaca. I will do that across the board for all of these spins, and I will just keep the dial at exactly the same. I'm trying to draft the same too, so hopefully the diameter of these yarns should come out fairly similar. That's my hope, but keeping in mind that if there is a little bit more loft from the wool, even with the same drafting techniques and the same amount of twist, it could bounce that yarn up and make it be just a little bit thicker. And I guess that goes back to what I was saying about how it's really important to swatch and sample your yarn to get the gauge you're going for, because there are just so many factors that can affect it, especially if you are doing a large project like a sweater or shawl or something. It's just really important to sample, test, swatch, all of that. I love it when I can get that unsupported long draw going. Ah, there it is. So fun. this is very interesting to me. Right away, I was getting slubs in my yarn, and I had to pull those out, stop spinning, get in there and fix the slubs. I'm doing a little plyback test here, and this is actually becoming a much bulkier yarn than the others, and it's not because of the drafting. In fact, I feel like I'm drafting a little thinner at this point. It's because of the loftiness. It's really bouncing out to a bulkier yarn, but it's an airy, it'll be a very warm woolen type of yarn. And so I can tell right now, like, just the whole feel of this is very, very different. And I am kind of actually, I knew it would be different, but just the drafting, it's like less slippery. It's a little, I wouldn't say sticky. It's not necessarily sticky. It's just not slippery. I don't know if that makes sense. Sometimes I feel like we don't quite have adequate vocabulary to explain with words the tactile sensation that's happening, because there's so much information that my fingers are giving me that I just don't quite have language to express. But this is interesting how different that amount of wool suddenly can just absolutely change the alpaca. And I think actually this might be my favorite of the yarns I've spun so far. And I really do love alpaca, and I love working with alpaca, but this blend is making a really cool yarn, and I can't wait to see this one all finished up and to knit with it a little bit. I might take this blend and do a larger project from it. I don't know. Stay tuned, I guess. We'll see. I'm probably due for an alpaca project at some point. And now I'm ready to do the 50/50 batt. This one is the springiest and bounciest of all the batts. In fact, when one of my kids came down and saw all of these laid out on the table, of course I said, touch them, and what do you think is the difference and everything, and he absolutely was able to tell that this one had a lot more bounce and spring and marshmallowiness to it. It definitely feels very different and much, much more characteristic of the merino. I really feel like the bounce of the merino is overpowering the drape of the alpaca in this batt. So I am very curious to see, of course, how this one compares to the rest of them, but you can just see how springy and bouncy this one is. This just has such a crisp feel to it. I think that's with the bounce. It still has a silky feeling, but the drape, I can feel the lack of drape in the draft. It's, oh gosh, here I am again trying to explain this very tactile feeling, and I don't have all the right words to get the little nuances in there. But yes, I can definitely feel this is a blend, and it definitely does, as I was noting about the batt itself, it definitely does feel like the characteristic of the merino is overpowering the characteristic of the alpaca. So even though it's a 50/50, it definitely feels more like the wool does than the alpaca does. So I think that's a very interesting kind of observation to note about this blend. The first thing to check out is that I used this little Ashford it's a 1 yard all the way around. It's a little sampler nitty knotty. And when you look at the bottom of all of these skeins, when they're laid out equally, they don't all come to the same. This one's actually a little tiny bit shorter. This one's a lot shorter. They don't all come out to the same length when they come off of the nitty naughty. If you want a closer look, feel free to pause on any of these, but I am going to do a quick handling of the yarn in front of the camera so you can get an idea of the grist, the bounce, the swoosh, and also give you a picture of what the yarn looks like. So we are going to start with the 100% alpaca. And here is the yarn. It feels very much like alpaca to me. It has drape, but as I try to squish it, it's hard to get the whole thing on the camera, and stretch it, it's not really stretchy. This is how long that yarn is, and it doesn't have a lot of spring back or bounce to it, but it does have a lovely drape, and it's a very nice yarn. So our next one is the 90% alpaca, 10% wool. So as I stretch it out, we can see it has a tiny bit more bounce than that 100% alpaca does. I hope you can see it on the camera, but it does have just a tiny bit more stretch, which is really interesting to me because it's not that much added wool, but it's enough to make a difference. So here is the yarn. It's lovely. Definitely still more drape, but I think this would be a really nice yarn to work with. Who's next? This is the 75% alpaca with 25% wool. And when we do that stretch, oh, I can definitely tell this has a lot more springiness to it. Can you see the stretch and bounce in this yarn? There's a lot more bounce in this one, and I can feel that too. It feels airier. It doesn't feel as dense. It feels loftier. While I say that, I do think that the wraps per inch are about the same and consistent across the yarns, but having that extra bounce factor, I do think, is causing a difference in the way the yarn itself behaves. And this one is absolutely the one where I feel like the wool character is taking over. Can you see how bouncy this is? As I stretch it, it has so much more spring and bounce. This is definitely a livelier, bouncier yarn, and that's not because of the twist. That is just because of that crimp. Look at this, how stretchy. It's much more elastic, and it doesn't have quite so much drape, and it's that crimp in the wool is having such an effect on that. So there it is. I really like this yarn, actually. I might do something with this in the future. So there's one last look at each of the yarns, and I will be back with some knit swatches, and we will see how each of these blends behave in a fabric. We are about to have the final ultimate reveal of this project, which is the swatches. And I have to say that I am so glad that I did this sampling testing project with the alpaca and the wool, the sheep. Thanks for joining me, friends. I have learned so much doing this, and even with the experience of spinning and working with alpaca that I have already accumulated, this as a very intentional observational exercise has taught me so much. So I highly encourage all of you, if you are working with alpaca, if you're doing a large project with alpaca, definitely do some samples, make some swatches. It's so important. And while I know and I hope that you gained a lot of information from my experiment here, there's really nothing like having it in your own hands to touch and feel how the fabric behaves, how the fibers come together. And so I encourage you to do this experiment on your own. I also want to let you know that if you want help with your spinning projects, I do offer private lessons through Zoom. You can contact me at my email, which is in the description of this video down below. So check that out if you'd like to set up a private session with me. I can help you with your spinning, answer questions, help you sort out what equipment you want that meets your needs, all of that. So without further ado, let's take a look at these swatches of the knitted yarn that I have spun up from these various blends. Let's begin with the 100% alpaca. This fabric is very soft. It almost has sort of a silky feel to it, maybe even a little bit of a halo from that alpaca. Now when I give it a stretch, and I observe it does come back together a little bit, but this is a really nice fabric. It's really lovely, and I think for certain applications this is perfect. But it's important to know what our fabric is doing so we can make sure it ends up in the perfect project, right? So let's take a look at the next one, the 10% wool with 90% alpaca. So this one has a little bit more bounce to it, especially when I pull it not width-wise, but top to bottom against the stitches. It springs back into place, it bounces back into place a little better. There are still some gaps between the stitches, but this one, while it still has that drape from the alpaca and that very silky, almost halo kind of quality from the alpaca, I do feel like it has just a bit more bounce to it. Here we are with the 75% alpaca and the 25% wool. It has a little more bounce to it. It has a little more of a crisp kind of feel to it, I think. When I stretch it either direction, it bounces back into shape a little easier than the 10% wool or the 100% alpaca. It does have that kind of silky drapey feel to it, but I'm starting to feel a little bit more of a loftiness to it. It feels a little more like a woolen kind of yarn with that sort of fluffy airiness. I'm getting a little more of that in this fabric than I was with the 10%. So I think that this 25% addition of wool is starting to give it a little more of that wool characteristic, but it still has the feel of alpaca, and I think this is a really nice blend. This is a really nice blend. I like this one a lot. And then we have the 50-50 wool and alpaca, and this one is it's just like I was feeling in the yarn itself. This one absolutely has more of the wool characteristic overpowering the characteristic we were getting from the alpaca. This has definitely, it snaps right back into shape when I tug on it, either direction against the stitches, sideways or lengthwise. My suspicion is that this is what people are talking about when they say that alpaca doesn't have memory. I think they're saying that when you tug on it, it doesn't snap back into place in the same way that wool or a wool blend has more of that characteristic quality to do. Something else that I noticed when I blocked these, and now that I'm looking at these, the two that I did with the most alpaca, the 100% and the 90% alpaca swatches, are wider than the ones that had more of the wool in them. And again, I think that's what we're seeing when we talk about that shape of it growing and stretching out. So if you are going to do a 100% alpaca garment, does that mean that you can't or you shouldn't? Absolutely not. This is just examining the alpaca I was working with my own spinning style and my own blending techniques. There are so many things, as we mentioned before, that can affect the yarn. Even the amount of twist you're putting in, the grist, the quality of the alpaca you're working with can also have a huge impact. But that's where we come back to sampling being essential, and swatching is so important. So I hope that this doesn't deter you from pursuing projects that you would like to do with alpaca. I hope that this is informing you on some ways that you can test out your fiber, try some sampling, and as always, I will wish you happy spinning. And if you do any of these samples, I would love to know how it turned out for you, what you've worked with, what your experience with alpaca has been. I will see you down in the comments. Happy spinning.